to get to the most important issues on how to move forward. So I first want to take a minute, Oscar, if you allow me, I am to really thank the participation of everybody. Yesterday was a very long meeting and we had a lot of people present throughout the day. But I also want to take a minute to acknowledge the partners and the donors that have been with us. Ireland, um, Canada, Spain, but also WFP, UNFPA, Belgium, of course. I hope I'm not forgetting anybody. UNICEF, it's been incredible that the support from the technical to the administrative, and in so many ways. I don't have the list here, but I wanted to take a minute to really say it's important that we continue and we listen to you. And we admire your patience through multiple emails and meetings. So I wanted to take a minute to really acknowledge and thank you for your continued support. Okay, so we have a meeting today that we are going to really dive a bit deeper in the methodology. But before we get into the methodology, there's a few issues that I wanted to take a few minutes to discuss. First, I want to just introduce a few people as well, in case you need to get in touch with them. Of course, you know, Oscar and Alan are champions from the side of UNDP, really that brought this vision to life and brought the partners together. But behind the curtains, there's a lot of people that are incredibly supportive, and you may need to get in touch for this particular pillar. Okay, Ben Murphy is our focal point from UNDP for the partnership pillar, and at least temporarily for the planet pillar. For now, you need to know for the partnership pillar, Ben is our person for this. Then we have Shiv, who is in March fully on board in UNDP as our chief methodologist, really supporting the initiative of all pillars, not just the partnership, but it's important that you know he's the one that will be working, the two of them, very closely with AIR. And then Christina, here in the back, the one that you've been engaging in multiple emails back and forth. And then we have a few others that will, over time, in Tanda, you will see our communications and digital expert as well, working on multiple aspects. But I just want you to have a sense of who they are, because they are engaging with you on a daily basis. Okay, but let's get started. So this is our agenda for today. We wanted to really try to spend a few minutes more on discussing what's expected of the management group members. Yesterday, we started discussing this a bit, but I think this is important that we continue a bit more and start to develop, because we will have, we'll try to rewrite the terms of reference and get clarity and share it with you. Then we will dive right into the discussion of the methodology and prioritization of the scope of the synthesis that will be presented as a proposal by the American Institutes for Research, our colleagues you've met in the last couple of days, Thomas and Andy. There are only two, but they're a very large team engaging in this synthesis to be able to very quickly produce some results. Then we will hopefully start a discussion towards validating the scope proposed by AIR in terms of the 3 out of 5 focus groups, knowing that we're not going to completely ignore the other 2, but we need to focus on the 3. And then I hope we can come out of this meeting with some clarity of what we need to do next and who is going to be engaged in really getting the work done for the next steps. So this is what I wanted to start with. to start some thinking about the management group, I'm not going to give you a list of what we think the management group should be doing or the roles, but I wanted to show you a few activities that we imagine that we will need to work on. So the first one is really the development and planning period that we are at this moment now, where we really will need to submit names of experts for the technical advisory panel, and we'll need to coordinate a strategy to mobilize financial resources. This is not as important for this particular pillar, financial resources, because we have it fully funded, but this will serve for the other management groups as well. So I wanted to leave it there. So we estimate around 2 days of engagement and work from your part in meeting with the management group and part in conversations and coordination with the secretariat to send the names, discuss the ideas, and really come up with the plan for resource mobilization, but in our case, specifically the technical advisory group. The second point is support evidence gathering for inception, scoping, and protocol development. So for this particular group, we are advanced, so we need to rush. We really need to identify how we're going to gather the data, especially the evaluation reports, so AIR can quickly start working on this material. But for the other management groups, it starts even earlier. There's some information, there's some additional work that will be needed around designing in terms of reference, identifying some groundwork. So we will have to do a different one for the other groups. Then we have the expectation for this pillar to present the preliminary findings in July for the HLPF. Therefore, we hope to have a meeting where we'll have, support evidence gathering for inception, not ground truth, and review political sensitivities in the preliminary findings. So this group will not be the ones quality assuring the bulk of the material and the content and the information that AIR will be producing. Let's call it the preliminary report, but we will definitely have an engagement with AIR and hear from them and pay attention to the political sensitivities of the preliminary findings that they're going to show us. This is quite important because the advisory panel of experts can really look at the methodology and the subject matter aspects of the content of the technical issues we're working on, but the specificity of the language that member states expect to hear, the sensitivity, the political sensitivity of the language that UN agencies can put their name on there to present to the executive board, to a summit, an SDG summit. It's something that we are perhaps better positioned to advise than the experts. So we need to work together with that group in that sense. And there, we estimate about a day, which is pretty much just listening to Thomas give us a presentation ahead of the HLPF. So we listen to it. That will come to us already after the technical advisory group have seen and re-looked into the content. Then we have the review again of political sensitivities of the draft report and manage the editing and design phase of the product. So I'm not really thinking that we need to go through the entire report and check and edit the language of the report necessarily, but of some key products, yes. So if we're producing recommendations, if we're producing findings in whatever format that we find it more useful for member states or different audiences, then yes, we will need to have some moments there of comments in writing and then perhaps even a discussion. And then in the end, we need to discuss and design a communication and uptake of the recommendations plan to move forward. So this is just an initial thinking. It's just a suggestion for discussion, so we can start a little bit of exchange.
Thank you very much, Ana Rosa. I think at this time, it would be interesting to have a quick presentation, introduction, right? So that we know who is at the table forming part of the management team. Let's start online first. So allow me to call you by the names that I see on screen. Daniel, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure, Oscar, thank you very much again for inviting us to this third meeting, in this case for the management group of the partnership pillar. My name is Daniel Jacobo. I'm from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation of Spain, specifically in the Division of Evaluation of Development Policies. And today I'm with my colleague, Almudena Oficialdegui.
Thank you very much, Daniel and Almudena. Welcome to the meeting. We're delighted to have Spain on board. Can I call on Rachel Inger? Or Rachel? I don't know. Yes, please. Go ahead. Okay. No, she's not muted, but we cannot hear her. If you can put perhaps in the chat the institution or that you're represented, that would be very helpful. Can I call on Ada, please?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much, Oscar, Ana Rosa, and colleagues. Delighted to be with you this morning. My name is Ada Ocampo. I am the president of the IDEAS Global Network. IDEAS stands for International Development Evaluation Association. Happy to be here and to contribute as much as I can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ada. I see Molly. Molly, can you please introduce yourself?
Good morning, everybody. Molly Buckley with Global Affairs Canada. I'm the Deputy Director of the Decentralized Evaluation Service Unit, and my colleague Isabelle Mercier is in the room with you. So good morning.
Thank you very much. Welcome, Molly. I see Judith, please.
Hi, everyone. Very happy to be with you. I am the head of the Global and Synthesis Unit of WFP's Office of Evaluation. Very happy to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. Welcome, Judith. Can we have Rachel now? Still not possible to listen to her. Andres Bott. Sorry, we cannot hear you well. Andres Botero. No, sorry, the quality of the audio is really not good. But if you can please put in the chat your affiliation, that would be highly appreciated. I see Agnesa. Please, Agnesa.
Yes. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Agnesa CDI, and I'm a research associate for AIR, American Institutes for Research. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I see Melissa Rogers.
Hi, I'm Melissa Rogers, based out of Washington, D.C. I am a quantitative researcher at American Institutes for Research.
Thank you. I see Ozen Guven.
Hi, everyone. I'm Özen Güven. I'm a senior researcher with American Institutes for Research, and I will be working on the qualitative evidence synthesis for this project.
Welcome. I see Melissa Roth. Melissa? No. Okay. So,
We did.
Okay. Rachel. WFP already. Ada. Rachel. And Fabrizio. Fabrizio Belloni.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now, Rachel. Please go ahead.
Apologies to everybody. Sorry for the technical issues. Yes, my name is Rachel Ingersoll. I'm representing the Department of Foreign Affairs in Ireland, and I'm an evaluation manager here.
Fantastic. Welcome, Rachel. Delighted to have Ireland with us. Fabrizio, please.
Many thanks and good morning, good afternoon. Fabrizio Felloni, Deputy Director, Independent Office of Evaluation of IFAD. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I see OIOS, IED.
Hi, thank you, Oscar. This is Eddie Ugo of the Inspection Evaluation Division of OIOS. Very glad to be here and thank you for the initiative.
Thank you very much, Eddie. Welcome to the meeting. Let me see who is missing. Ross Tanner.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ross Tanner, UN Women Evaluation Specialist. Happy to be sitting in to learn more about the management group for this pillar.
Thank you. Welcome, Ross. Huey Kim.
Yes, good morning. My name is Huey Kim, Evaluation and Reporting Head at the Joint SDG Fund. Nice to be engaged in this.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Head of the Evaluation and Reporting Unit at the Joint SDG Fund.
SDG. SDG Fund. Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. I see Avery Chakra.
Hi, everyone. I'm Aviri Chakraborty, and I'm an economist at AIR, and I'll be working on the synthesis.
Thank you very much. Welcome. I see Moritz Schultz.
Yes, hello, Moritz Schubert from the Independent Evaluation Section. I'm here on behalf for UNODC. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Welcome. Let me see. Yu Tian.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yu Tian. I'm from the Partnership in Statistics for Development in the 21st Century, Paris 21. Nice to meet you.
Very much. Welcome. I see Australia.
Good morning, everyone. I'm just attending in listening mode. We're not formally part of this initiative, so I'm really just here to listen and learn. Thank you.
Thank you very much. But can you let us know your name, please?
Yeah, it's up on the Zoom. It's Bronwyn Works from the Australian Permanent Mission. I'm a senior advisor there.
Fantastic. Welcome to the meeting. So let's took the time now here in person, please.
Martin Borzo, also in listening mode from Switzerland.
Welcome.
I'm Andy Coombs. I'm a qualitative researcher with AIR.
Hi, my name is Thomas De Hoop. I'm a managing economist and a team leader for this evidence synthesis from AIR.
Thank you. Welcome.
Alan Fox, the Deputy Director for the Independent Evaluation Office of UNDP.
Philip de Maaschelk, Belgian Mission, also in listening mode.
Thank you.
Morning, Christophe Legrand, Officer in charge of the Evaluation Unit of UNCDF.
Welcome.
Good morning, Deborah McQuinney from UNFPA's Evaluation Office.
Morning, everyone. Carrie Albright, Principal Advisor, Deputy Director at UNICEF Evaluation Office.
Morning, everyone. Isabelle Mercier, Director of Evaluation at Global Affairs Canada.
Welcome. Can I invite you to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Luz Fernandez. I'm part of UNDP Bureau of External Relations and Advocacy.
Thank you. We have various colleagues from the Independent Evaluation Office, please.
Kate Palm, Communications at the IA.
Anis Prodan, IT Specialist.
Boaz Listek, Research Analyst.
Andrea Arenas, Research Assistant. Roberta Badelar, also from the Bureau of External Relations and Advocacy here.
Tanda Mandu, Evaluation Analyst at IO, but also part of the SDG Foundation.
Thank you.
Yeah, Christine Probilska, Logistics and Administrative Evaluation Assistant.
Very good. Please.
Yeah, I was introduced by Shiv. I'll be part of Anna's team soon.
Morning, all. Ben Murphy from the UNDP IEO Evaluation Specialist.
Great. And I think we have, please, here.
We have Rasmi, IT Analyst, IO Evaluation team.
Fantastic. All right. So we know in terms of institutions now who is around the table. All welcome, not just the active members of the management team, also the observers. We are delighted to have you with us today because we understand that this is a learning experience for all of us, right? And therefore, we want to really benefit from your contributions. All right. Ana Rosa has established a few tasks for the management team in a sort of timeline. Which I think is important is to the estimated time dedicated to do this in terms of reviewing the documents, providing comments, and participating in important meetings. The timeline, of course, goes from now, January 23, until September 23. right? And so that will be the commitment until we get the final product. And perhaps there are still some areas for clarification in terms of the roles and responsibilities, particularly in relationship to the technical advisory panel. There may be some areas of overlap where we may have different understandings and not yet arrive to a common understanding how to delimitate the boundaries between the work of the management team and the work of the advisory panel. But many of you are seasoned evaluators and have experience in this type of settings. Therefore, the clarification coming from you in terms of the demarcation of roles will be highly appreciated. And do you want us to get into that discussion now, or do we move to the second part of the meeting and have more clarity on the methodology, and then the process will look clearer once we understand the results of the methodology, right? Okay. And can we pass the floor to our colleagues from AIR? Thomas, there is no microphone needed because I think your voice, if you speak loud enough, your voice can be heard. Can I confirm from our online colleagues that you are hearing well? Great. Okay, good. Excellent.
Excellent. I will just wait for the presentation to on the screen. Thanks. Maybe just a clarifying question from my side at this point, and both of it is fine. So if I would just do the presentation without comments, it would take half an hour, but I'm happy to take clarifying comments during the presentation, and it may take a little bit longer. But then there's some room for discussion if there's immediate room for clarification. Sure. So thanks all very much. I think probably almost all of you were here yesterday as well. Maybe not everybody who is currently online was there yesterday, but as I mentioned, my name is Thomas de Hoop. I'm the team leader from the SDG 17 synthesis team from American Institutes for Research. I'm really excited to be working with this management group and with everybody else who is going to be involved in the SDG Synthesis Coalition. I'm here with Andy Coombs, my colleague and senior qualitative research synthesis specialist. And I think you already heard that there were several people also from our team online. We have a larger team working on this evidence synthesis, also to account for the fact that we're going to work on 3 different components, and we're having people with different areas of expertise, but also that will help us achieve some of the objectives of the ambitious timeline, where some people can focus on one area and other people can focus on another area of the evidence synthesis. So we're going to briefly talk about the purpose of the meeting, but essentially I think what we're going to do here today is really give you a sense of what our proposed approach is to make sure that the evidence synthesis we conduct is rigorous, meaningful, to generate lessons learned and present recommendations related to how to accelerate progress on SDG 17, while keeping it also manageable within the ambitious timeline. And for that, we will start with research questions and SDG 17 conceptual areas. We will also link that to your theoretical framework that I already showed to all of you yesterday as well. I will tell you a little bit about what we have been doing so far. We started this project at the beginning of January, even in the last week of December, but you can imagine that not a lot happened in the last week of December. But based on that initial assessment, that scoping review, and we have done some pretty comprehensive searches, we will discuss some proposed inclusion and exclusion criteria. Really happy to hear all of your feedback there and to hear your perspectives also from your respective agencies. Important to recognize, and I just want to put that up front, that we may have to make some trade-offs during this meeting, given the ambitious agenda that we're facing. probably we have to make some choices about what we can and cannot do to make sure that we have recommendations ready for the high-level political forum on sustainable development. We will discuss all of that, and we will finalize with some next steps, during which I will also present to you all like a short deliverable schedule that we have already contractually agreed upon with the UNDP. And like eventually we're going to come back to the proposed scope. So I would suggest maybe any like comments really about content, let's leave those for after the presentation, but any clarifying questions, let's make sure that you ask them immediately. So I already mentioned that I would start with a theoretical framework, and it's a really like broad conceptual framework, just like the partnership pillar of the SDGs is a really broad like sustainable development goal. And in a sense, because it's so broad and because of all the linkages with all the other SDGs, it's really important to like make this conceptual framework overarching and big picture in a sense. But if we want to go a little bit more specific, essentially when we talk about SDG 17, we're talking about 5 components. And those 5 components make up the partnerships between different actors. We're talking about finance, we're talking about technology, we're talking about trade, we're talking about capacity building and systemic issues. And for each of these, like in some way, there is a partnership component associated with it, in which governments, the private sector, and civil society are coming together. And those partnerships like moderate the relationship between finance, technology, trade, capacity building, and systemic issues, and the eventual like indicators of SDG 17. For finance, it could, for example, be like government revenue. It could also be foreign direct investments. For technology, it could be internet access. It could be also clean energy adoption. For trade, it could be like the volume of exports. This is also where trade and finance somewhat overlap. You can also imagine foreign direct investment could fall both under finance and under trade. So like there are lots of linkages even within SDG 17 between the different topics. But essentially like the partnerships and those various components combined with like capacity building and systemic issues can ultimately result in enablers for some of the other SDGs. And like there are so many SDGs, like they relate to the social sector, to health, to education, to prosperity, to the planet, and like all of the objectives that fall under SDG 17, in a way, how they link to the other SDGs is that they serve as enablers. And we're not just having this theoretical framework for the sake of having a theoretical framework. We're also like very much using this theoretical framework to guide our methodology. And so I will come back to it. So let me start with some research questions. And just like the theoretical framework, we again, like the research questions are pretty broad. And like we can break these down into more specific research questions at a later stage. And implicitly, the more specific research questions are already there. But essentially, we're talking about 4 research questions, 4 broad research questions, which cover like which SDG 17 targets are currently on track and which are lagging behind, which countries have made the most progress on SDG 17 and why, as well as like an assessment of which countries have possibly made less progress and why. In addition, we're looking at which interventions are most effective in improving and accelerating SDG 17, and how and why are some of those interventions more successful in achieving those outcomes. So you can already see from these research questions, different methods are required. And like all of you were here yesterday, you know what kind of methods we propose. We will come back to that later, but essentially we're going to look at voluntary national review data and other SDG data to really focus on the upper 2 questions around like SDG targets and their indicators, while the lower 2 questions are really about a synthesis of impact evaluations. When we talk about effectiveness and when we cover how and why questions, we're focusing more on UN performance and process evaluations. So when we look at like what we will all do, at this moment, we're really in the process and we have a proposal of a thematic area identification. We did a rapid problem analysis or like a scoping of the existing literature, and we're starting to. Could someone mute? I will continue, but no worries. We're also talking about the question. Yeah. Yeah. Are we okay? Thanks. So we have already been doing some searches as part of the inception phase in various databases. I will talk about that in somewhat more detail, but essentially we've been looking both in academic databases, specifically the Web of Science, for impact evaluations, and importantly to recognize, and I just want to repeat that here, we're looking both at evidence inside and outside UN organizations. So impact evaluations, for example, like we know the UN does some of those. It's a relatively limited number. So we primarily look outside the UN for existing impact evaluations in academic databases, as well as the database of the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, which is probably the largest repository of international development evidence that exists in the impact evaluation space. And in addition to that, we also have looked at the United Nations Evaluation Group database, and we have done some explorations on AIDA at this point and see how those two can potentially interact with each other. In the future synthesis phase, and we're already there, we're looking at identifying the interventions, and that can be very broad, the 5 components, but also within those 5 components, we need to think about which interventions we do include and which interventions we don't include. Then we conduct an evidence synthesis of the impact evaluations. We conduct an evidence synthesis of the performance and process evaluations, and a positive and negative deviance analysis, and an analysis of VNR data. Yes?
I did notice that there was a question.
Oh, I did.
So perhaps, I don't know if it's possible to show the chat if questions come up. And I think there was a question there. I saw the beginning and it was sort of the same question I had, so. I don't know if it's possible to see the chat.
I think that the presentation is not that long. Why don't we finish the presentation, then we open.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure. So based on our scoping and based on some of the comprehensive searches we have conducted, we propose to focus on 3 thematic areas within the SDG 17. Finance, trade, and technology. I explicitly say focus and not exclusively focus, because we will include elements of capacity building and systemic issues. Specifically, what we aim to do, and this is our proposal, is to ask questions: what role does capacity building play in achieving some of the finance, trade, and technology objectives? What role do systemic issues play in some of the finance, trade, and technology objectives? And finally, based on conversations with the custodian agencies, we also propose to focus specifically on evidence associated with statistical capacity building in low and middle income countries. And I just want to give you an overview of some of the typical studies we found based on the scoping. So finance, what we found quite some impact evaluations as well as performance and process evaluations that focus on interventions, programs, or policies to increase tax revenue. In addition, we also found quite some studies that focus on interventions to increase foreign direct investment, and a smaller number, but we also found some studies that focused on increasing remittances. Technology, we found quite a few studies that focus on interventions to increase internet access and interventions to stimulate renewable energy. In the trade sector, we also found interventions to increase exports. In the capacity building and systemic issues side, and this is like one reason among several why we propose focusing on capacity building and systemic issues within trade, finance, and technology, is we found studies that focused on building the capacity of governments to generate foreign direct investment. We found studies on building the capacity of governments to stimulate renewable energy. And we found a focus on building the capacity of governments to diversify exports. We also found studies that focused on supporting governments to implement data systems. This is certainly not like a comprehensive overview of what we found, but these are just like some like really typical examples of what we found. When you look at capacity building and systemic issues, and this is not on the slides, but when you really specifically search for capacity building and systemic issues, and you start looking at the studies, what you will see is that capacity building generally doesn't only focus on capacity building. It focuses on capacity building in the agriculture sector. It focuses on capacity building in the education sector. It focuses on capacity building in the health sector. It focuses on capacity building and environment. Very similar for systemic issues. So this is like key here when we make these choices, like when we would specifically focus on capacity building and systemic issues without linking it to trade, technology, or finance, we would essentially synthesize everything. And all those topics that are not related to trade, technology, and finance can essentially be covered under some of the future evidence synthesis as well. And I would actually suggest, without knowing like how those future evidence synthesis will look like, based on my current knowledge, it may make sense to ask specific questions within the planet pillar or within the prosperity pillar, like what is the role of capacity building in achieving some of the objectives of the planet pillar? What is the role of systemic issues in achieving some of the objectives in the prosperity pillar? So similar to this, like, so not leaving them out, but probably dividing it up among some of the, like, this is like, this scoping was needed. I just want to like give you some numbers of what we found. Also, like when we look, we used search string. Happy to share that search string also like after this meeting. And we use that search string in various databases, like in Web of Science. And this is, it's important, the information that I just presented, because if you look purely at the numbers, you may actually think that there's quite a lot of evidence on capacity building and systemic issues, even in the impact evaluation space, and maybe less in the finance space. But when you start looking at the actual studies here that are behind the numbers, then you will actually see that there's much more focus in the finance, trade, and technology on SDG 17 specifically. Whereas if you look at capacity building and systemic issues, what you actually see is that there's much more focus on some of the other SDGs. So this is like the key reason why we propose building in capacity building and systemic issues through trade, finance, and technology, but not making it a topic on its own, because it would basically become like close to impossible to synthesize with all the different topics that are associated with capacity building and systemic issues. So I already mentioned like quite a few things that we have done. I'm going to go through this a little bit faster. Just purely for the timeline at this point, like we're hoping to finalize the inception phase like in February 2023 based on these initial choices, and to then continue in February 2023 until September 2023 with the synthesis phase. One thing that we will probably do, not probably, we will do it. We will have to break up the synthesis phase in two phases, where there are certain choices where we have to make that some of the things we will do by the high level of political forum and sustainable development. Other things we may do after the high level political forum on sustainable development that may, for example, include some of the more sophisticated analysis, like meta-analysis take time. especially effect size calculations. And we may be able to do some of it by the high-level political forum on sustainable development, but not for all interventions that we include. And like our proposal is essentially to break it up a little bit, the scope. And like one additional thing, for example, we could do is like we could pick to search in some databases by June 2023, and to then also still pick some other databases between June and September 2023 to really have a comprehensive overview of the literature. And the idea here is essentially that we will like end up somewhere in the middle between like a full-fledged systematic review and a rapid evidence synthesis. What the actual definition is of a rapid evidence synthesis, like people have different opinions on that. Like, what is rapid? Is it 3 weeks? Is it 6 months? Like, I think what you can call what we do by the high-level political forum and sustainable development, like a rapid evidence synthesis. Like, people who tend to do systematic reviews would call it a rapid evidence synthesis. But we will not achieve a systematic review also by September, but we would be able to get much closer to a systematic review by September. So I already explained a lot of this. Like at this point, we have already identified seminal papers for each SDG 17 component. That said, and that holds for all of the people in this room, what we really like to have from all of you is papers or reports that you consider as seminal, that like you really think like, if you miss that, then it's really not a good evidence synthesis. And we would like to receive those as soon as possible. It's like evidence synthesis aims to be as comprehensive as possible, but you always miss something. It doesn't matter what you do. So like, it's better if you share those materials with us. In addition to that, like we will conduct searches across databases. We will evaluate the relevance and the quality of the results, and we will assess the value add of individual search terms and refine those. So in the synthesis phase, and this is maybe just to give you also an assessment of everything we will do. So at this moment during the search, we will identify all potentially eligible studies. All the numbers I just showed, those are not the number of studies that are going to be included in the evidence synthesis. Usually a systematic review starts with thousands of hits in the databases, and any evidence synthesis will. The number of studies that you will eventually include after screening, coding, and quality appraisal is usually a lot lower. Like I've started systematic reviews with 60,000 hits and ended up with 25 eligible studies. So this is where the screening comes in. During the screening, you start with a process of abstracts and or executive summaries when it comes to reports. And you essentially see whether there's some potential that the study is like eligible according to the inclusion criteria based on the abstract on the executive summary. Then you you eliminate some studies based on the screening. And during the coding, you look at you look at the full text of the studies. Increasingly so, and we're exploring those options, and like we have some tools in-house as well. People use machine learning also for this, in which during the screening, you actually like use textual analysis or natural language processing to actually like assess based on a machine learning process to make this process faster. During the coding, you can do so as well. And even during quality appraisal, though I'm a bit more skeptical of how much machine learning can do during the quality appraisal stage. But eventually what we will do, and we will use different tools for impact evaluations and performance and process evaluations, we will assess the quality of the evidence. Happy to discuss those in more detail as well. For the quantitative evidence, and when I say quantitative, I mean impact evaluation evidence, we will extract information on like the effects of specific interventions on specific outcomes to estimate and pool effect sizes. And then we will examine the confidence in the studies through the previous quality appraisal, which is usually in quantitative research called the risk of bias assessment. We will conduct a meta-analysis, which is essentially statistically pooling all the effect sizes so that you can both estimate average effects as well as like variation in those effects. And we will triangulate this with qualitative evidence, and like qualitative evidence will really focus on performance and process evaluations. in UN databases where we will analyze content, assessing confidence in the findings, what works and what does not work, and map results. And we have existing tools also for the qualitative research for like some of the quality appraisal I spoke about. Eventually, we also hope to generate evidence gap maps for both quantitative and qualitative research, which can then hopefully like guide some future research agendas. Not to forget about AIDA, we have 2 proposals for AIDA. And I know we have a meeting scheduled later today. AIDA is a new tool for us. We've been doing some explorations for it, and very exciting to know that the UN is exploring the option of like using some artificial intelligence to like synthesize results. And like what we hope to do is, based on our exploration, to develop some methodological lessons on the use of artificial intelligence by comparing what we find in full reports with what we find in AIDA. And for those of you who don't know, like AIDA basically extracts paragraphs from studies. It doesn't extract full reports, which has some limitations because you cannot see like the quality of the study, like just based on a paragraph. But it also has some, like, it can make the process a lot faster because potentially you have to read less. So you have to review less. But to keep this process rigorous, what we propose is that we extract information as part of the thematic analysis during the synthesis phase, but that we do so after quality appraisal. So we do so only for those studies that do meet our inclusion criteria from a quality appraisal perspective. But then we also hope to analyze like some, to make use of the AIDA tool in that way, and we can discuss that later. Ultimately, like I already mentioned, we have the like statistical analysis as well. And like what we really hope to do is, based on the VNR data, the voluntary national review data, we're aware that there are some limitations of those data. They're mostly qualitative, but what we hope to do is select some countries that have done really well on some of the SDG 17 indicators, and to really understand why they have done well. Do some additional case studies on those countries through statistical analysis to really explain why those countries have done well. And then that gives us a powerful option to triangulate that evidence with some of the impact evaluation and performance and process evaluation evidence, because we can see whether, if they have done well, whether the reasons they have done well align with some of the impact evaluation evidence or not. It's very well possible also that the reasons they have done well doesn't actually show up in impact evaluation. Like classic example, like many people criticize impact evaluations because they don't look at big picture questions on like why economic growth happens, for example, in China. Like China hasn't done a lot of like RCTs to like increase economic growth in its country, but it has done a lot of experimentation with like exports and things like that. So this is one way in which we can triangulate these different approaches. I think you can probably like call like approaches at the macro level versus more micro level approaches to assess evidence. So we have I already mentioned some inclusion and exclusion criteria. And like one key question is, of course, like, is there sufficient high quality varied evidence to conduct comprehensive synthesis? Based on our initial scoping, we think there is, based on the choices we have made. Like when we say initial, like we also want to keep it manageable for ourselves within the ambitious timeline. We may not find hundreds of studies that meet all the eligibility criteria, but it's also probably not going to be feasible to synthesize hundreds of studies within the timeline that we have, at least not with all the tools that we want to implement in terms of quality appraisal. But I would not be surprised if we do find like a substantial number of studies. We have already found quite a few impact evaluations. We have found quite a few performance and process evaluations. I do think it's fair to say that the impact evaluations probably focus on like probably more easily evaluable interventions, whereas the performance and process evaluations probably focus on like broader like programs and policies. So that also gives like a nice mix in that respect that you can look at, especially when you also combine this with the VNR analysis and the country case studies. So we are aware that there is a request to also include evidence from high-income countries. We have a proposal there. We know that specifically official development assistance is like a key topic here. What we have found based on our initial scoping is that if we search exclusively for low and middle income countries, that the available evidence reduces quite dramatically. Not surprisingly so. There's a lot of evidence in the US, in Europe. And when we include evidence from high-income countries, we want to do so, but we want to focus that on a number of subtopics more than that we want to do that for the entire SDG 17. So official development assistance is like one topic where I know there is specific interest. So what we propose is essentially to exclusively focus on high-income countries when we focus on ODA. Then one key question, and in a way I've already hinted at that, is like, to what extent do we include studies with outcomes linked to other SDGs? So one thing that we propose here is that like we do include studies that focus primarily on SDG 17 indicators. We do include all those primary studies, but it's not going to be feasible within the ambitious timeline to also look at the impact of on like more longer term outcomes that actually fall under some of the other SDGs, at least not for the primary studies. What we can do is see whether there are like additional systematic reviews and evidence synthesis that actually look at those longer term studies. There will only be a few of those. And so that we can already give like a little bit of a teaser on what some of the other SDG evidence synthesis could potentially find. Like we have already found some systematic reviews, for example, related to trade and economic growth. And there will also be other systematic reviews. We will not have like the ability to synthesize all those individual studies included in those systematic reviews, but we should be able to link some of the evidence that we found that is specific to SDG 17 to some of the systematic reviews that like essentially ask the question, how does SDG 17 enable some of the other SDGs? So this is coming back here. Here a few more, like a few other proposals here in the finance space, like in the spirit of SDG 17 as an enabler. We propose to not include evidence from micro-level interventions, such as microfinance or cash transfers. It would open a can of worms in terms of like everything. Like there's so much evidence in that space, and it more easily applies to some of the other SDGs, such as the people one, for example. So I already mentioned this. We will avoid studies related to the impact of trade on economic growth and poverty reduction, but we may include some evidence synthesis related to that. Also because, frankly, it's probably not as exciting maybe to learn about the impact of trade on exports, but unless we already know whether or not exports could potentially like increase some of the economic growth or could have like implications for education and health outcomes as well. For technology, and this is, we also primarily focus on enablers, so internet access and clean energy, for example, but we do not include evidence from studies examining impacts of technology on education and health outcomes. Possibly, perhaps, again, for some systematic reviews. We do need to see how many systematic reviews there are to see how feasible that is going to be. These are just some illustrative outcomes. I think I already went through many of these. What is interesting from us from an evaluation perspective, if you look at some of the SDG 17 indicators, like we're talking about this as outcomes, but some of the SDG 17 indicators are essentially outputs or like interventions from an evaluation perspective. Like a free trade agreement is not usually considered like an outcome, but it's considered like an outcome under SDG 17. Similarly, for policies such as non-tariff barriers or like tariff policies, this is the nature of SDG 17, and in a way, like the theory kind of assumes that these kinds of interventions are enablers of some of the other SDGs. So in terms of like methods and quality appraisal, like this is like a little bit of a summary of what I've already focused on. But in addition to that, in terms of language, we propose to focus like exclusively on English studies at the moment. That seems feasible within the timeline. I also doubt that we will miss a lot when it comes to Spanish and French studies. There will be some, but I don't think the volume of Spanish and French studies will be such that it will like change our findings. So it may not be worth it to specifically focus. The marginal benefit of including French and Spanish studies might be relatively low in comparison with like some other choices we want to make. Point for discussion. We can consider some options there. Just in terms of methodology, impact evaluations need to have a credible control or comparison group and focus on the enablers of the other SDGs. And performance evaluations need to use normative, descriptive, or cause and effect questions. One discussion we had, and I think is essentially that at this point we're under the impression that we will only include performance and process evaluations that actually call themselves something that is related to performance and process evaluations. Occasionally, you will find a study that doesn't call itself a performance or process evaluation, but it has some elements of a performance or process evaluation. We have, for the moment, decided not to include those because it takes a lot of time to actually figure out whether or not it's performance or process evaluation when a study doesn't actually call itself performance or process evaluation. We're making it a little bit broader. So like a participatory evaluation will also be included. Something that calls itself like a process tracing study will also be included, but a pure like ethnographic study that focuses on an intervention that is not explicitly calling itself like a performance or process evaluation. At this point, they're considering not including those. I think I've been talking for a while. This is just like to give you a little bit of a sense of some of the studies that we found. Tax revenue is a major source of public revenue in South Africa, and it plays an integral role in creating the fiscal space to provide public services. So these are kind of the questions in terms of performance and process evaluations that we find. Very similarly for trades, like performance evaluation focused on strengthening the national capacities of export sectors in Latin America and the Caribbean. Very clear example of a kind of study that mixes capacity building and trade in this case. And we found, for me, it was at least a little bit surprising. We found a substantial number of those actually among the performance and process evaluations. Technology, we also have other examples. I already went through the timeline. I want to end basically with a summary of the proposed scope in two phases. We propose to choose SDG 17 components based on the availability, breadth, and equality. And specifically, we propose to include finance, trade, and technology SDG 17 components with a capacity building and systemic issue lens. And we propose to also include statistical capacity building based on conversations we have had with some of the custodian agencies where there was particular interest in that topic. We do not include outcomes that overlap with other SDG outcomes, except possibly for some systematic reviews and evidence synthesis. And we prioritize outcomes that are enablers of other SDGs. So essentially, in evaluation language, you could possibly call it intermediate outcomes in the theory of change, like exports, internet access, or government revenue. In a sense, like those outcomes by themselves do not contribute possibly to welfare, but those outcomes enable like other, like the achievement of other objectives. And we propose to mostly not include micro level interventions. They're like, especially not in the finance space where like microfinance or savings groups or self-help groups, you can easily label those as like finance or financial inclusion, but those have such a different nature from like debt relief, that we propose to not include those, also because they really fit much better in some of the other SDGs. In terms of study design, we primarily focus on primary data collection designs for enablers, but we may include some systematic reviews for final outcomes. I already talked a lot about study objectives. One final thing that is important to mention is that we primarily will focus on studies published between 2015 and 2022, and in English. So these are like all proposals. It's all based on like a pretty comprehensive search that we have done already and like a scoping of the available literature. And like this is essentially which we believe is feasible to do by the high-level political forum on sustainable development. And like we can do some more sophisticated analysis possibly after that. But we need to make sure, and that's like a primary goal. If we want to make sure that this evidence synthesis really like has the recommendations have influence on policy, we need to make those recommendations by the high-level political forum on sustainable development. So that's the presentation. I know that's a lot of information, more than yesterday, but I hope it was interesting and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Very comprehensive, very systematic presentation as well, which is greatly appreciated to unpack the complexity of the SDG 17 partnership pillar. We have a number of questions already in the chat and here in the room. So I would really ask if you can focus your participation on questions. But we will collect a number of questions, at least 5 for each group. Many of the questions that were already in the chat were explained later in the presentation, and that's why we wanted to wait until the finalization of the presentation to open the question and answer sessions, right? So let me now open the floor for questions. I see Daniel, please.
Yes, thank you very much for the comprehensive presentation. It already answered a lot of my questions. Nevertheless, I think that the area of systemic issues shouldn't be overlooked if we want to have a focus on what was one of the main questions, that is, what was the model of partnership look like empirically. In this sense, I'm missing more evidence or more importance of policy and institutional coherence and multi-stakeholder partnership in the analysis, because I believe that these two areas or targets from systemic issues are really the core of the principles of the effectiveness agenda, such as ownership, alignment, harmonization, mutual accountability, and is one of the core of lots of bilaterals and its programming that later are the basis of all the interventions that are related to the different SDGs and such the different synthesis and pillars. So this is just my first point. And later, I'm missing, because I see that trade is one of the main areas, and I'm missing some of the main actors in its management group. For example, the WTO, or in the case of bilaterals, such as Spain, the European Union, which has the final competence on trade policy. And finally, yeah, it's a pity to hear about the difficulty of including reports in Spanish, but we can enable the possibility of including in the synthesis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Very clear points. Deborah, please.
Thank you very much. Question related, and apologies for not bringing it up earlier, but I think this is the best place for it, even though the conceptual framework was presented yesterday. When I go through the SDG 17 indicators, I can understand the grouping that you've got on finance, trade, and technology, with one fairly big exception, and you touched on it a little bit at the end around statistics, and specifically indicators 17.18 and 17.19. Given the importance of data, given the importance of statistical systems for the measurement of SDGs, I think if we miss this, it's going to be a fairly big gap. And I don't think it can be picked up elsewhere, and I don't think it falls under capacity building or systemic issues, unless, and that's my question, does it, and has it been characterized that way? And relatedly, I wonder, I think partnership, someone from the Partnership and Statistical Development is online, and they are the custodians, so I'm not sure if you've spoken to them And if so, what their advice was. Relatedly, the indicator 17.16, which UNDP and the OECD are custodians for, the global partnerships for sustainable development, would I would think be important to not lose sight of. And I wonder perhaps if through searches for evidence there wasn't much that came up. So that's perhaps a related question. The third question, I guess, is whether there would be time and openness to having sort of not proxies, but other terminology that's used. So there's so much diversity in our evaluation practice that to say only performance and process evaluation and search for that may in fact be limiting. And it may not be that difficult for our agencies or other offices to say, we call it this, even though it is a process evaluation, however, we refer to it in this way. So to quickly get a table of common terms so that we don't lose out and you don't spend time searching to determine what kind of evaluation it is. So those are my points. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you very much. Carrie.
Thank you. I have a few, but I'll try and be quick. So you asked the question, I think, around whether or not we should also focus on high-income country data. And I think for me, if we end up having an EGM or a portal, I think it'd be good to hear some more about the filters, I guess, because I think obviously the geographic filters so that we could screen out HIC data if we wanted to in due course. But from UNICEF's perspective, it's also really important at population level. If we could have a screen that kind of screens out child-related evidence or with the age categories would be really helpful. I still have an itch that I'm scratching around this, leaving the capacity building and systemic stuff. I mean, I completely understand why for the HLPF, I think we have to prioritize, but I wonder whether there's a possibility, maybe even once all the syntheses are completed, to come back and look at that again. Because yes, I know, I take your point about a lot of those interventions being thematic, but there are ones that are not thematic. So we've talked about the statistical stuff, but also evaluation capacity strengthening, scientific capacity strengthening around academies of science, etc. There's a lot of stuff out there that I think would be actually really interesting to come back, but maybe we do it at the end and aggregate what we've learned across the different syntheses and then see what's missing. I don't know. Be good to think about that. Let me leave these ones, they're not so important. Yeah, I think we have to be really careful about the HLPF messaging, really careful. Just because we're already leaving out a couple of elements and then we're only doing subsets of the different, and I completely understand, and I think we have to, but at the same time, we don't want to present something that we then have to retract if the analysis later on shows more in depth. So I wonder whether, I don't know, this is a political question. I wonder whether the HLPF presentation is more about the methodology and where we've come and whether we should focus findings at the SDG summit. I don't know if the representative from Ireland wants to talk about that, given the focus on data and evidence. Maybe that's too late, but I think let's think about what is feasible to present at the HLPF. That also kind of linked to the question yesterday about whether we need more hands on deck that could help with the screening, the coding, the quality appraisal, whether that's some of the SDG coalition members could second some more junior staff, or I think everything that we can do to think about, getting as much as we can before HLPF is really important, and also feeds into the capacity building request that we had yesterday from coalition members. I've always liked the positive negative deviance analysis. I think that's really innovative, but do we need to build in some stakeholder consultation with member states around that? Is that even feasible? But that would enhance ownership. And then finally, I agree with the colleague from Spain that even though not including Spanish and French literature may not change the analysis a lot, I think it's a political element to this. I think we really do have to look at that. So again, I think let's think about how we could include those languages somehow with additional capacity and how we get there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kerry. I see the hands of Yu Tian from Paris 21. Please, Yu Tian.
Thank you very much. I want to thank and also echo the point on the importance of the statistics, because I think the SDG framework overall, the indicator framework is huge, and since its adoption, it has put a huge burden on the national statistical systems around the world to monitor over 200 indicators, and yeah, these are the countries we work with, and they really spent a lot of time to really improve their system and to be able to report still, yeah, some like over 100 indicators each year. So I think it's important to consider statistics, and even and in the statistical community, it was like a huge relief or like achievement when statistical capacity building was included in the SDG, because in the MDG era it was not in the framework, and the capacity building of statistics and data was really not putting on a priority. So I think that considering that dimension is really important. In terms of the high income data from high income countries, I would say definitely we have to consider that, especially when we talk about international financing, development financing, because if I think this coalition, this can be a good opportunity to look into the transparency of all the aid data, the official development assistance data. Because although like you can find this huge database from our colleagues at the OECD, when you want to look into specific support to a sector or to an issue, it can be difficult. So I think it could be a good opportunity to look into those data from high income countries and look into the transparency like within those data. Also, I think in development financing, especially when you look into a specific topic, a specific sector, how the country's perspective, the recipient country's perspective can be very different from the donors, because funding are channeled through implementation agencies and the Ministry of Finance, when the actual for example, the Ministry of Health or Education or Statistical Office got the funding. It's what they can report is very different from the global reporting from the high income countries. So I think it will be important to also include high income countries. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I have two more hands here. Isabel, Christopher, and Alan, please.
I'll try to be brief. I'm hoping you're willing to include evaluations, process and performance evaluations from bilateral. Okay. And then my follow-up question is a plea to, I like Carrie's idea about maybe following up on the capacity building. I don't know about all the other bilaterals, but certainly for Canada, capacity building is a sort of an essential linchpin in terms of building relationships with other countries. For middle powers, it's one of the key tools in our toolbox to build relationships, to lay the foundation for trade agreements and so on and so forth, as a mechanism. And I think excluding it entirely, unless it's tethered to those three things, may miss some of the insights that are actually really important in terms of when capacity building of that nature works as an enabler and when it actually is challenging. So perhaps a plea to include that, maybe not immediately, but certainly as a follow-up, or at least tag somehow any evidence you're getting. Because I suspect if you include bilateral sort of evaluations, a lot of what you'll see is capacity building insights that I think are important.
Thank you. And Christophe, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just a quick question regarding the French and the relationship with LDCs. So under the partnership pillar, there's investments in LDCs, and we know that a big group of LDCs are French speaking. So I was just wondering about your sense of the evidence in English language regarding French speaking LDCs, which are currently quite dominant. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Alan?
Thomas, I really appreciate the detailed discussion of what's to be included and not included. And I recognize that when you're doing this, we have to make some exclusion. But you did mention one in terms of environmental outcomes. And I know that in the planet pillar, there will be a lot of information on that. I just think we need to keep in mind that when you look at SDG 17 and you talk about technology, you talk about trade and these other issues, it is for sustainable development. And it has a very strong environmental lens in terms of the expectations for what's being traded and technologies that are being developed. So I think we need to keep that, my hope is that we keep that strongly influencing the kind of analysis that we're bringing up and data that we're tracking down. Because I think it's not just trade for its own good, it's really trade in sustainable products. It's financing that also improves the opportunity for greater utilization of sustainable mechanisms. So just a point as we move forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me give the floor back to Thomas to respond to these questions. And then colleagues, particularly the ones who are participating online, if you can open your mic to verbalize your questions, that would be greatly appreciated. Thomas, please.
Thanks all for these comments, and I will also let Andy respond to some of those as well. I think some of these are counter questions for myself to all of you. I can see why everybody thinks capacity building is important, and like what we really try to do is to like make the scope specific by linking it to trade, technology, and finance. So this is actually my counter question for all of you. Like, it's not going to be feasible for us to just include all capacity building, no matter what. What we can consider is to make this much more specific. Like, I think everybody is aware, like, capacity building is important, but it's also such a fluid concept. So it means everything. And because it means everything, it means nothing at some point, and you don't know anymore what you're talking about. And I heard, like, for example, the comment from, like, I believe it was IFAT online, which I thought was interesting, where there was a linkage between, like, capacity building, ownership, and accountability. And then I think there was another comment, I believe, from our Canadian colleagues suggesting, like, capacity building is really about relationship building between countries. So I wonder whether, if we want to do this, whether we can maybe make this all a little bit more specific when we talk about if we include more elements of capacity building, how we include elements of capacity building. Because I don't think we can include all the capacity building related to agriculture. I don't think we can include all the...
But can you respond to the request of including capacity building for statistics? Right? Because that is another topic that came in various...
But I think we are already including that, right? I wonder whether that was that a misunderstanding, possibly?
You mentioned it, Thomas, yeah, but I think...
Because we are actually including capacity building for statistics. So that's one way in which we make capacity building more specific and like actually include that as part of the evidence. It's essentially like a fourth topic next to trade, technology, and finance.
That clarity is very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of add to this point, because I don't think we're necessarily speaking at cross purposes here, right? So we've said that we'll include capacity building specifically on the stats, which has become a clear issue through discussions in today as well. But I mean, Isabel, you mentioned that I really understand your point that a lot of what bilaterals are doing is around capacity building, but within the sort of the scope of SDG 17, I think we have to think about what types of capacity building are we talking about here. So I mean, Thomas's point is that when he did the scoping, capacity building was on so many different things that fell outside of the scope of SDG 17. So if, like, we're finding evaluations, for example, that are evaluating the effectiveness of partnerships work, which might include capacity building on trade, finance, and technology, those would be included. And I think that kind of meets what we're talking about.
For me, it's just the question of the mechanism of capacity building as a tool for relationship building. Whether it's in agriculture or education or whatever it is, that mechanism and how it's done, because it could be done many ways, right? What works and what doesn't work is very interesting for me, for Canada. And I assume for several other bilateral donors who are doing a lot of capacity building in an effort to strengthen relationships between countries, right? That aspect of it as a mechanism is interesting to me. And I can't see that being covered globally elsewhere in any of the other pillars. Because it's not the outcomes, like it's agriculture, for example. Yes, I'm interested in the outcomes of capacity building in agriculture, and that would fit somewhere else. But that mechanism and the different approaches and the different contexts in which it works and it doesn't work and so on and so forth, that to me could drive some really interesting insights. And it's being used more and more and in creative ways. And I think we need to think globally about what works best. And this could be an opportunity to have that reflection.
Thank you. Can you continue your responses, because this is just one topic, but there are many others.
It might be one of the bigger ones. I think on the language, I think we can certainly consider that. I think possibly what we can do is we can look at the limited number of databases that are specific to Spanish and French language studies. I certainly understand like the political reality here of like making sure that, and I think you're right, like evidence is underrepresented in Francophone countries, for example, like that's no question about it. But I think we may have to search for like a specific database that really covers it, rather than universally looking for Spanish and French literature to also keep it manageable to some extent. On the staffing, I find that an interesting idea about like doing some of the tools. I think we would probably need to talk about what kind of skills are required. Because the risk of bias assessments do actually require pretty like advanced impact evaluation skills to implement those. For example, and I don't, like, we would usually not let RAs do those ourselves, the risk of bias assessments. Like, they can do them to a certain extent, but we can talk about, like, what kind of skills are required.
Explaining and coding, yeah.
Let me see. On the environmental outcomes, so this is, I think, like, an important point, right? Like I would say, and this is like just based on my scoping, we would increase our scope tremendously if we would start including the effects of trade on environmental outcome. We would include a lot of additional studies. So I think maybe there as well, we need to, like, I'm not sure whether that's going to be feasible, but as I said, like what we can do is we can include systematic reviews related to trade and environmental outcomes, for example.
Can I just add to that? We did discuss the importance of also in all synthesis, keeping in mind the principles of the SDGs, what makes it different, you know, the focus on sustainable economic and social aspects, and leaving no one behind as well. You know, there's a number of things that it might not be the focus of the three topics that we isolate, but we cannot ignore. And there has to be, anything that we produce will have to be nuanced considering the principles of the SDGs. Otherwise, we're not doing it properly.
All right. Can you address the question from Spain on the systemic issues, particularly on partnership models?
Yeah, I think that is a bit like the same comment. I would say it's a different comment. I realize that, but it has like a similar connotation as like some of the capacity building elements. I think where possibly what we need to do is like define very specifically what that means and what kind of capacity building. Like what I can say on the capacity building, maybe as a counterpoint, or that's actually an important distinction. Like I liked what I heard about like we're possibly less interested in like how capacity building relates to agricultural outcomes or relates to like education outcomes, but we're more interested in like the process of the capacity building in a sense and how that can contribute to certain outcomes. So in that respect, what I can already hear is like maybe we don't include all the impact evaluations related. There already seems to be like a distinction here between the types of methods required to include capacity building, where impact evaluations that focus on the effects of capacity building on agricultural outcomes, I don't think that's what we're looking for here. I think what we're looking for here is more the process of like how countries like collaborate with each other, how and shift.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, what's coming through is I think you said it, capacity building as a mechanism, and also I think it's about the kind of sorry, I'm looking at it's policy and institutional coherence as a mechanism, right? So we have to think of on our side what implications that has for the conceptual model, build that into the conceptual model. And I think that there's also an issue here about, Anna, what you were talking about making sure we have like this social, economic, and environmental lens to everything we do. So we need to build that into our conceptual model. And we need to think through the implications of that, what that means in terms of the extraction and the presentation, the findings. But that's going to be key to how we take it forward.
Thank you, Ben. And then I would like to invite other colleagues online, which have a number of questions that have not been yet addressed. Ben, please.
A very quick one, Thomas. For the technology, it's defined by the broadband and the energy technology. But linked to this environmental outcomes question, that cleaner tech package is broader: environmental pollution, air quality. Was that intentional based on what you've seen and the coming out of the evidence, or is that somewhere that we could expand?
Yeah, that's actually, I think I see like similarities in a way between the technology and environmental outcomes and the trade and economic growth. In a sense, like the adoption of clean energy, in a way, like I feel that pretty clearly falls under SDG 17. Whereas like, but I see that as an intermediate outcome in a sense where the adoption of clean energy ultimately, like, it's not so, the reason we adopt clean energy is because we want to achieve improvements in environmental outcomes. The reason that we like adopt certain trade policies is like because we want to improve economic growth or poverty reduction. So I do want to come back with a suggestion here, like, because I think it's important to recognize that we're still proposing to include systematic reviews on these topics. So we're not leaving the topic out at this point. And we have already seen like a number of systematic reviews on this topic. There are systematic reviews on, or even if there are no systematic reviews, there are literature reviews or evidence synthesis on like the effects of technology on environmental outcomes. There are literature reviews on like trade and economic growth. So in that respect, and I think that also addresses Anna's question or comment to some extent, we're not leaving it out. It's just not like it's not the majority of the evidence that we're including. We are including the social, economic, and environmental aspects of it. It's just more like true, like essentially a synthesis of synthesis.
Good. Thank you. Do we have any more questions online, please?
Daniel might have his hand up. Don't know if it's an old one.
There's some comments in the chat.
There's a number of questions in the chat that it would be nice if people could voice, because some of them have been explained already. WFP?
Yes, WFP, please. And is that Danielle's? But after WFP, please. Yes.
Thank you, Oscar. Thank you, Anna. Yes, we had a couple of comments from WFP, and the first one is basically echoing some of the comments already made today. And this speaks basically to the selection of the 3 topics. Given that we are talking about partnerships, SDG 17 being an enabler for other pillars, we feel that it would make sense to focus on those topics that are cross-cutting for other pillars, meaning capacity building as enablers. So this is to reinforce basically some of the comments already made. And then we had several comments or clarifications on the IDA tool that was mentioned. We would like to know if is the idea that all the evidence provided by partners would be integrated into the platform, and that the platform would then aggregate evaluation information from across the UN system and beyond. So that's a first point of clarification that we would appreciate. The second point is to better understand how the evidence will be harmonized. Because in WFP, we are working to develop a platform to enhance the use and access to our evaluation. And we are keen really to ensure that we are not embarking on overlapping exercises. And on this, we would like to understand whether IDA is being used as a tool for the exercise, or whether advancing the capabilities of IDA is an end in itself. So that's the second point. And we have a couple of other points on IDA. So the third one is, will IDA become the only source of information? And finally, it will be important that to clarify if IDA tagging system will be expanded to reflect proper tagging of all agencies involved, given that it might not be aligned with other agencies' mandate. So there is a potential risk of losing important information there. And then it's important also to clarify the cost to be covered and the role to be played by each agency or partner to maintain the tagging. So I hope I was clear, and thank you very much.
Yes, you were clear. Thank you very much. Allow me to respond that very quickly. And let me start by your third question. Is AIDA going to be the only source for this synthesis? Absolutely no. It's not even the first source. The contracting process with AIR was done without considering AIDA. So the technical proposal that we have received is to follow the technical procedures that they usually use for undertaking this type of synthesis and reviews. There are various questions there regarding the AIDA, but I hope that this clarifies. We are still exploring the extent to which the capabilities that we have developed in UNDP for AIDA can be used to accelerate and facilitate the process. But that is to be explored. It's not in the contractual terms of what AIR is expected to deliver. And therefore, I think it's for a separate discussion on AIDA to respond to the remaining points of your question. I see Danielle and Ada, please.
Yes, just let me come back to the previous discussion regarding capacity building and systemic issues. Yes, I'm completely agree also for us. We target the evaluation of our partnerships and our policy and institutional coherence mechanisms as this nature, like a mechanism for policy dialogue between our country and our international partners. So not only the focus on capacity building, but also on those international agreements that are the result of this policy dialogue of bilateral cooperation as the Spanish cooperation. Yes, would like to clarify on this and add on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Ada? Ada Ocampo, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Oscar. Thank you very much to the AIR colleagues for such an interesting presentation. As I put in my chat, well, I would like to build on Anna's intervention on the principles and link this to the political dimension on the 2030 agenda. So the principles are not only about sustainability, of course, that's one principle, and also no one left behind, that's another one. But in terms of partnerships, I would like to know whether you have considered, for example, if the partnerships initiatives, decisions, etc., have led to reduce inequalities in countries, for example. So linking more or to share the accountability in more effective terms. So again, the importance of linking the scope of the synthesis to the principles underpinning the 2030 agenda would be fantastic, because that would allow to go beyond the technical aspects that are sound, and we can see in the presentation that they have been. It's a very technically sound approach, but to me would be really good if it is enriched with the political dimension. How are the partnerships, who is participating, what is the results of the partnerships leading to, and not only to see effectiveness in a way, I would say in a traditional way, but linking this to the principles and the political dimension of the evaluation. Finally, I mentioned that it will be important to put in the picture the parliamentarians as well. I don't know whether they are integrated in civil society, but they have a specific role to play, that, or they might be playing, or they will be out of the picture, but I think they should be in there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, I also see this, and I don't know whether this was the same question about the definition of partnerships, and like we have actually had like long discussions about the definition of partnerships, and we have actually purposely decided not to include a definition of partnerships at this point, precisely because if you look at the SDG 17 indicators, it's not so obvious what that partnership definition should be. If we would like have a really explicit focus on partnerships, we would actually exclude many of the SDG 17 areas. If you start defining partnerships like the way academics would probably define it, because trade, is it really a partnership if two countries are trading with each other? Probably that's how it was labeled under the SDGs. But I also wonder, like, I get the impression that partnerships to a certain extent was used at the branding for SDG 17, but not everything that falls under the SDG 17 partnership pillar is about partnerships.
Thank you very much, Thomas. That's already a very interesting insight from the exercise, right? And the fact that the team at the American Institute for Research has been thinking about that, whether to include an agreed definition up front for the conduct of the exercise, and decided not to do so in order to be comprehensive and really try to gather the evidence that is coming under SDG 17 is already very telling. But thank you very much for that clarification. All right, Anna, you want to participate?
Yes, I want to answer to, well, comment on a few points that I think we didn't answer. Deborah mentioned about the evaluation titles. I think that's incredibly important. You know, our own evaluations are not called process or performance evaluations. So I think we definitely need to see how you're doing that. But I believe it's very
fine.
fluid. We will cover it. Don't worry.
We're not seeing that as a controversial.
It's just how we identified it in a simplified term to in the concept note, not necessarily how they are doing it, you know, how we are gathering. All the evaluations will be considered there. I think it's becoming very clear that there's a call for including capacity development and systemic issues. Although it's very clear we can't necessarily include everything, but I do think we need to think through a clear answer of, because we've been saying they're not going to be excluded. They're going to be considered but now we need clarity of how they're going to be considered. You know, it's very clear, we're going to consider statistical capacity development, but what else? So it will be good for us to work on bringing that clarity. Consider, you know, when are we considering capacity development on the mechanisms aspects? When are we considering systemic issues? So I think we need to bring that clarity to make clear to partners that we're not completely ignoring the other two issues. They're just being approached from a different angle to make it feasible within the timeline. I fully agree with the point on the HLPF, and I think we will need to continue to meet and see how far we get, and then assess where we are, how comfortable we are in terms of what can be presented credibly. And if all that can be presented credibly is less than what we expected, that's what we will be. Otherwise, all the rest of the exercise will lose purpose. In terms of filters, I think that's something I think it will really be important to have a conversation because as we mentioned, we want to go beyond 5 reports. We want to build this platform, and these filters will be important for all of us. So it may require a separate, very difficult and perhaps boring for some meeting, but very important for future all 5 synthesis and beyond. And the translation. Yes, I can see it is a key point. We need to figure out, we ourselves are struggling with AIDA. We have reports in different languages and we are studying. So we will come back with some ideas and I hope AIR will too. But in the end of the day, we also, if the answer is we can only do if we hire people, we need money. So then we will have to go back to the initial discussions of we will need more resources. And yes, in kind is always appreciated, but there's a risk of bias. So we cannot just accept anyone. There needs to be a structured way of doing that. But I will stop here, but I will come back for next steps.
Sure.
Yeah.
Maybe Chef has
Sorry, Oscar. Can I just add?
Sorry?
Can I just add?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So just on the capacity building thing, I'd be really interested in seeing some examples of the evaluations that Isabel and Daniel will be talking about, like to see how you're sort of operationalizing, you know, these evaluations on mechanisms such as policy coherence and capacity building. So we can have a good think about what, you know, how are we treating capacity building systemic issues? Is it a mechanism? Is it a specific intervention, or are we considering them as a mechanism? The thing on the filters, I think, is a given. You know, we'll have all the filters, but we just need to decide which.
But if I understood correctly, the suggestion made by AIR is that it will be included within the areas of SDG 17, right? Particularly for getting clarity about the outcomes coming out of those capacity building efforts. So the question on the topic is if we agree with that, right? Because there is a very clear proposal not to ignore, yes, to include in a limited scope, saying more related to partnership issues, right? So including statistical developments, right? Which is one of the areas. But I think that the proposal is clear. Let me add one additional point in terms of the search strategy, because you're asking for contributions to the database, right? And so that is kind of a pull strategy, right? Or a push strategy. I don't know how to better understand it. I mean, who pushes and who pulls, right? But I think we need to get some clarity about that, because we will be accessing different databases, which will constitute the bulk of your work, and you will be accepting additional inputs, right? But clarity on those search strategies to fill in this universe, I think would be appreciated. So perhaps we can spend a few minutes on that to clarify that process, which includes also this labeling of process and performance evaluations, that if we are too rigorous on that, we will be excluding a great deal of information coming from bilaterals and multilaterals alike.
Yeah, on that point, on the process and performance evaluation and like the labeling, I mean, every agency uses its own jargon, right? In terms of like how they call evaluation. It's certainly not our intention to exclude evaluations just because they have a different name. But if something essentially, like I think I was not clear on that, like we're aiming to not include studies that are not evaluations.
Great. All in agreement. Perfectly fine.
The one thing we kind of agree.
Great. Okay, and on the pull and push strategies?
Yeah, I think what we can do is we can come up essentially with like an Excel sheet where we define to all of you like what our very specific inclusion criteria are. But I think to some extent, like this happens always like you start coding and additional questions come up during a systematic review because you always have a gray zone whether something is eligible or not. So I would then also encourage you, like, look at the Excel sheet, but don't see it as like something that is completely set in stone. Like, feel free to like also share a report that maybe doesn't strictly meet all the inclusion criteria, but comes close to meeting the inclusion criteria, because that might actually be a reason for us to change the inclusion criteria if we better understand the gray zone of what should be included and what shouldn't.
Perfect.
Yeah, just to say that the push and pull are mutually exclusive. We're covering all the bases here. So in addition to asking for kind of key resources and key literature, they'll be doing the systematic search as well, and all of that gets put into the mix. So yeah, we're trying to be as comprehensive as possible in doing that.
Right. One last point, Thomas and colleagues, is on the deviance analysis and the statistical analysis. You have mentioned the VNRs, but I haven't heard very clearly if you're also including just the pure statistical analysis of the indicators.
So I think the first thing that we're planning to do, like the VNRs are probably the first thing that we're going to look at. And we're actually exploring some options. I don't know what is feasible, but one thing that we're actually thinking about is like, can we, like the VNRs are primarily like narrative. So it's not going to be feasible to look at each and every VNR. But what we can potentially do is bring them together, the VNRs, and actually use some natural language processing potentially and see whether there are like patterns in the VNRs that show up in terms of like what works, also in terms of progress, what the countries report on. But in a way, the VNRs, yes, we will also look at the data to just simply answer that with a clear yes. And we will primarily look at the data at the country level in first instance. So those country level data will be the first step together with the VNRs, and the VNRs together with the country level data will guide us in selecting like 4 case studies of countries where we will do a somewhat more in-depth assessment of the statistics of those countries and like how the SDG 17 data come together there.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much for that clear response.
Also, and I have had discussions about this. I want to make sure that I mention when we say strong performers, we don't mean high income countries necessarily. We want to like have diversity in terms of like the regions of the countries that we analyze.
Perfect.
I had just an additional thought, actually, linking the discussion that we've just had today with the discussion yesterday on the criteria to select technical advisory panel members and experts. So if we are in fact agreeing to slightly broaden some of what had initially been seen in the conceptual framework, we might need to just revisit that in terms of identification. So for
all 5. You mean 5 topics?
Yes, exactly.
Yes,
yeah. So just to rethink that, and if some clear guidance on that can be shared for this pillar, that would help, I think, in the identification of experts for each of us, no, from our respective communities.
Great. Excellent. Okay, I think we deserve a coffee, right? We have been working very hard and very productively, I would say. Thanks very much to the colleagues from AIR. Very clear and systematic presentation. I think the exchange in terms of questions and answers has also been very helpful in terms of how this synthesis will be conducted. And, you are already exercising the role of the management group, right? In terms of asking questions, clarifying, contributing as well. And the contributions, as we have seen in terms of offering additional in-kind resources to do some of the elements of this are welcome. The financial contributions, we continue fundraising. But let me very explicitly thank the following partners. I want to thank Ireland for their financial contribution. I want to thank Canada and Spain for their in-kind contribution. I want to thank the World Food Programme, the UNFPA, IFAD, UNICEF, IFAD and UNESCO for their financial contribution, and UNICEF for their in-kind contribution. We welcome the participation of Switzerland, Belgium, and Australia as observers. That is really excellent, and we hope that we convince you that this is a very serious initiative and that you will be able to join the management group more forcefully based on what you have heard. But you are welcome to have more additional conversations bilaterally if you want as well. All right. Shall we have it, please, Alan?
Just very quickly, I know it was briefly mentioned at the beginning, but I think it's an issue that we need to pay attention to quite rapidly as a management group, and that is to provide those suggested names of persons that will be on the technical advisory committee. I think there's actually a bit of a pressure for us to start putting that together. You can see already in the discussion today, we had a number of discussions that also would be well received to have some technical experts assisting with us on it. So just for those who are participating, please let's give those names quickly to Ana Rosa so we can start putting that together. Shiv?
Could I also suggest that we look at names from the literature as well? So key authors of key evaluations, and we put those into the mix.
Right.
And also confirmations, I'm sorry, boss. Confirmations of who is really going to be in the management group. The names, the institutions and the names, so we don't have to bother us such a large number of people with multiple emails, so we can continue this conversation in a more fluid base, and I can send you documents, tiers of each rows and things like that, and the list of experts, so we can start to really narrow this down in advance.
Very quickly, I forgot to answer one of Ada's questions regarding the role of parliamentarians, which in some countries have been playing an interesting role, even for the VNR process. But we understand they are part of government, right? Legislature, one of the branches of government, and therefore they are not excluded from the exercise. Just to clarify, when we saw the conceptual framework presented by Thomas and colleagues, I think they are part of that circle, just quickly. But speaking about the advisory panel, yes, we also welcome suggestions from our partners online. And I think we are agreeing on a framework in which we will like to have representatives from civil society and academia, right? In the domains contained in the synthesis partnership pillar, namely finance, trade, technology, capacity development, and systemic issues. And so if we can find names around those areas, that would be greatly appreciated. All right. Copy. Right. And with that, let me thank the participation of our online colleagues. Delighted to have you on board. We will get the minutes from this meeting and the follow-up actions in terms of when the next meeting of the management team will convene. Once again, thank you very much for your participation.